Right, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about periodization, the methodologies and logic and rationale that I use when I work with athletes for Crossfit. With my background in sports science and strength and conditioning, I've obviously read a lot of the literature around periodization, and I personally find at times it can muddy the waters for a lot of people. But I am going to sort of delve into it to explain why I do it, when I do it, and what the methods I'm thinking of when I'm going through that process. But I break down periodization basically into three individual periods that kind of blend together quite nicely. The first period that I use in my programming, which is the furthest away from the competition, is a period that I like to call sorting your shit out. The second one is then getting your shit together. And then the third and final phase is when shit gets real. Now, I think a lot of people when they think of periodization think of certain physiological attributes that are accentuated throughout the year that you're trying to develop in order to build yourself up over the year to get to an end point where you're fitter than you were that time last year. So with CrossFit, quite commonly that's the open, that's most people's benchmark. It might be a different competition for you, but the same principle applies, that you're trying to get better for the next year. The problem becomes is when people focus, say, on becoming aerobically fitter in the first 12 weeks, but then allow that to die off for the next 36 weeks. So that by the time they get to the open, the gains they made the last summer don't come together. And ultimately everyone wants all of their gains to stack up at one time. So what I try and think of is rather than thinking like, right, for this time of the year I need to be doing this, this or this, I tend to try and think of like, what's the best thing thematically that I can be working on furthest away from the competition? And that potentially is your weaknesses. So the first thing you need to do is think about what it is that you need to work on throughout the year in order to improve, and therefore you just set down some goals and also figure out where you're currently at. Now in this example, I'm going to look at someone and say that they're going to need to work on their Olympic lifting strength, their base strength, their gymnastics, and build some low-level cardio in early on. So once I've done this sort of needs analysis of where an athlete's at and how far they're off of, the first thing that I try and set out in this first block of training, which can last anywhere from 12 to 24 weeks, is that this is a period in the year when you're going to practice things and break things down so you can actually then rebuild the component pieces to actually get better at Olympic lifting, ring muscle ups, whatever it is. I really like Ben Bergeron's idea that you either practice something, you train in something, or you compete in something. And this part of the year is very much practicing stuff. So this is when you're going to try and learn better techniques with whether it's pull-ups going from strict to kipping to butterfly pull-ups, whether it's learning better techniques on ring muscle-ups, so it goes from a couple of sketchy reps to really looking quite nice and slick on your Instagram page. This is a time of year where you might just set aside 15 minutes 3 times a week just to practice a movement. You're not going to obsess about rep schemes, you're not going to obsess about necessarily improving maximal outputs. All you're going to think about is, does this rep look better? Is it more efficient? Does this put me in a better place? Beyond the skill stuff, so the ring muscle ups, the handstand walking, all that kind of stuff, the other thing we're going to look at in terms of gymnastics is positional strength. It's a good time of year where, for a lot of people potentially on the rings or on the bar, they don't actually have the positional strength and or structural integrity to their body to handle those high volumes of gymnastics movements. These gymnastic movements aren't bad for your body if you prepare them in the right way, i.e. do you have isometric strength in key positions like a ring hold or even in the full script hang from the rings? Do you have the capacity in the tissues around your upper back and shoulders to go through several high velocity, high force movements like a ring muscle up? So this is why you'll see people put in gymnastics, ring dips, ring pulls, ring pull-ups, all that kind of stuff that gives you the tissue and the tensile structure and strength through your ligaments and musculature to handle those high volume gymnastic movements. So we're going to practice the skill, but we're also going to give you a stronger chassis, musculature to handle those volumes of those movements. Alongside that, that gymnastic strength kind of dovetails and comes together quite nicely with building your base strength in your core barbell movements, squatting, deadlifting, pulling from the floor, bench pressing, overhead pressing, all of those kind of lifts that again give you more musculature and more strength to build a foundation to then push on when it comes to CrossFit style events. Where you go with your strength training is probably going to depend on where you sit in relation to strength movements and Olympic lifting movements. If Olympic lifting movements your real strength and you can get a high percentage of your squats versus your snatch and your clean and jerk, you're probably going to move towards improving your squats so you've got a bigger foundation. If you already have huge squat and deadlift numbers, but your Olympic lifting is not great, you're probably actually going to spend a lot of time Olympic lifting, because that is more often than not where you're going to be tested in CrossFit. You'll sit somewhere between these two camps and you'll program accordingly. The other thing that then happens that we have to work on is just making sure that our aerobic base ticks over if we're going to emphasize strength. If you're someone who is very, or comparatively unfit, this might actually be where you accentuate the aerobic part more and you back off on the strength stuff, and that's where it has to be individualized in that off season. And that's why I'm not a fan of the whole idea of like you finish the open and you immediately go and do strength stuff. It all depends on where you are at versus your peers and who you're comparing yourself to. All of this means is you're probably going to be limited in terms of your like CrossFit wadding stuff. So I know a lot of people who get into CrossFit just love the Metcons, but ultimately, if you want to develop your strength and maybe your aerobic capacity, you're going to just have to move away from themselves. So you might be only doing 1 or 2 a week, and they're not going to be these monster hero wads to allow your body to recover and to optimize the response you get from strength training. So you're going to build this for 12 to 24 weeks. You're going to get better at how your technique looks, and you're going to start to ramp up the volume of the movements you do and the intensity at which you do them in order to build this big base of a huge Olympic lifting base, big squats, and better looking gymnastics movements, and the positional strength in those gymnastic movements. You would then move to the get your shit together phase. This is where things start to speed up, and in my mind, when I talk to my athletes, I talk about seeing what rattles. So basically, you've kind of neglected CrossFit for a little bit, and you're going to start introducing a couple of Metcons and things, and you're going to see what's dropped off and where any deficiencies are, and you're also going to start to assess what needs a bit more time and attention as you move towards competition. That said, like, you're still going to Olympic lift heavy, and you're still going to basically lift like an Olympic lifter. We're just going to start worrying about time constraints. So we're going to start bringing the time in, seeing if you can repeat high maximum percentages versus a clock. So you might start moving towards on the minute work at 80-90%, seeing how often you can repeat that lift. So seeing that your improvements in technique and strength start carrying over to more CrossFit-like things. We're going to probably start blending things together. This is where alternating EMOMs come in, where you might do on the even minutes, you might do an Olympic lift or a couple of reps for an Olympic lift, and on the odd minute you might complete X number of calories on a rower or an assault bike. So this then means you're starting to get used to lifting at an elevated heart rate. The gymnastic stuff starts to shift towards strength endurance for this individual. So we'll start looking at, like, can we increase the number of reps we can fit in with set time frames? Can we increase the number of reps we can do in one set repeatedly? So what can you do every 2 minutes? Can you go from doing 3 ring muscle ups every 2 minutes for 5 sets to doing 5 ring muscle ups every 2 minutes for 5 sets? The Metcon stuff starts to basically just look like what I would term capacity rounds. So every 5 minutes for 6 rounds, can you do X number of a gymnastic movement, X number of burpees, and X calories on some piece of cardio. And that's basically, the goal of that is to get used to sustainably moving. So it's something that the guys at OPEX talk about a lot, like, can you sustainably reproduce these numbers rather than constantly testing them? So this is the bit in Ben Bergeron's world where you move to training things. So you're starting to try and push the physiological boundaries. Here, early on, we're working on technical and max strength things. Here, we're starting to see if we can push on our strength endurance and our capacity to do things. That then eventually shifts on to where I would call shit gets real. Now this is like a 6 to 12 week, like if we were in MMA world, it would be like a fight camp preparation period. So you start thinking about what your competition looks like in terms of the actual events you're going to do, and what things really you need to start dialing in, like what is the things that you suck at that you just need to make sure you've either got a strategy for and or you can improve that physiological component. So this might mean that at the start of this period, you start actually doing a couple of the competition tasks that you know you're going to face. So you might, if it's for the open, you start doing open style workouts. If it's for a type of competition, you just might have a competition day with past workouts in it. So all of this bit here is essentially seeing what you can speed up and what you can start to challenge. This becomes a mix that's very individual and is tailored to that competition. But in this period, you still want to maintain strength in terms of Olympic lifting and squatting / pulling from the floor capabilities. But you also want to have most of your days structured towards Metcons and really starting to attack those things that you've been improving, and therefore you can start to actually show how much fitter you've got. So in Ben Bergeron's world, it pretty much moves from practicing, training and competing. In my world, it basically goes from practicing things and separating out all your different components through into speeding things up and assessing where you're at and moving on and trying to test those things out. And then finally at the end, it's just dialing everything in towards your competition. Throughout all of this, every individual sits somewhere on a continuum about where they sit. So if you're a guy who can already knock out 20 ring muscle ups unbroken, you're probably not going to have to spend so long practicing that thing. That allows you to have more energy to work on other parts earlier. Likewise, if you're a phenomenal Olympic lifter or you come from an Olympic lifting background and you're already snatching 140 and you can back squat 200, 220, this is probably something that you're not going to need maxing out. And that's why the individualization of programming is so important, because it allows you to thematically work through what things you need to work on and then what things you need to start bringing together and actually competing in, versus just following a cookie cutter format of work on some back strength, work on some hypertrophy, work on some endurance, work on some aerobic capacity. Because ultimately what happens is those things never actually all come together. You're trying to get everything together towards one peak. And that's why I think it's much better to think about it in this way than purely physiological ways.